and welcome to another evening of frank conversation here on Hard Copy. I'm Maukbe Ogun Yusuf. At the beginning of this week, former President Olusegun Obasanjo dropped what is now being widely termed a letter bomb. Among other things, the letter not only tries to dissuade President Muhammadu Buhari from seeking a second term in office, but also seems to have done a critique of his tenure so far. Now, part of what seems to have displeased the ex-president is President Buhari's handling of the conflict that has now been described as the farmers-herders conflict. Now, my guest tonight is Professor Chidi Odinkalu, a senior legal officer with the Africa program of the Open Society Justice Initiative and a former chairman of the National Human Rights Commission. I had interviewed him in the early days of Hard Copy. Then he had told us that the conflict was an existential one based on resources that were getting scarce for both farmers and herdsmen. However, considering the dimensions the conflict has taken, I ask if the framing of the issue, farmers-herdsmen conflict, is still correct.
I think it's ramified in many ways. It's ramified, it's escalated. But right now, I think what we've got is irresponsible government, with due respect. But I say that with a sense of responsibility and with pain in my heart. I tend to think that what we've got to address is incapable, irresponsible government before we can even get to begin to determine what the nomenclature is for what we're going through.
Because some people will say that the framing is also important. Then, when we spoke to you on Hard Copy in the early days of the program, we had just noticed Kaduna was the one under fire. Then Godo had just happened. It looked like it was going to spread to Benue, but that wasn't clear just yet. And one of the things you talked about was the scarcity of resources, saying that that was what was at the heart of the conflict which we were seeing then. But looking at the dimensions which it has taken on, in Benue, in Taraba, in Nassau, some parts of Nasarawa in some instances, in Kaduna as well, would you still say, and even in some parts of the north, for instance, Zamfara, where has been affected as well?
Zamfara has been going on for a heck of a long time.
Even though the nature has been different, they have suffered more cattle rustling.
But again, all of that is mixed
Are they all connected?
All of that is connected. And now, it's now abutting into the electoral calendar. So it's become so complex. In humanitarian studies, you've got what you call complex emergencies. And what we've got in Nigeria right now is a complex emergency. There is not one element that totally explains what is happening. That's as in the level of escalation. There are elements of different things. Some of them are at a higher level of intensity than others. But the causative factors are in a basket. Quite clearly, you've got climate change, okay? It's driving herds south. Part of the impact, particularly from the northeast, is driving herds and herders south, partly also driven by displacement related to the conflict in Borno and Yobe and parts of Adamawa North. So there's that element there. Secondly, there is impunity and bad memory from the fact that these things have happened and nobody has done anything about them. And so you've now got escalating cycles of reprisal and victimization, all coming together. The third thing is politics. It is profitable for some people to make political mileage out of what is happening. Just as it seems, I don't know why anybody will consider it profitable as government not to do something about this that demonstrates both empathy and capability. Now,
by government, I'm sure you're talking about the national government.
Yes, of course, a national government, but also not necessarily excluding state governments. But, by the way, at the level where life is lived in Nigeria, people don't draw the distinction between federal and state and local government and judicial and legislative and executive.
I'm drawing that distinction because it was seen that the state government are trying to do something about it. As at the time we spoke to you, then Ekiti State had led the way with the enactment of his own anti-grazing law. I think he was seeking to regulate. His own style was a little different. He simply said that herdsmen were not to be seen past 7 o'clock or thereabout. In In Benue now, what you're saying is that, you know, we don't want open grazing, we want ranches, that's what we want. But it would seem that the proposals by the state governments, proposals for solutions by the state government seems to be bringing more conflict instead of solution. Why do you think that is so?
I'm not so sure, because that is necessarily the case. The conflict was always there. It's a question of people trying to invent their own casus belli, their own reasons for escalation. And it's not just now that the state governments have led the way. If you go back, regional governments were primarily the people who started off initiatives to manage this from 1954 with the old Northern Region government. The first piece of legislation on grazing reserves in the country was in 1965. It's a piece of Northern Region legislation. As recently as 1996, Kaduna State enacted an Edict number 6, which is on the management and resolution of disputes between farmers and herders. Now, all of that framework has been dismantled by politicians who want to parlay this conflict for electoral purposes. That, I think, is part of the tragedy of the situation. And now, if you look at the pieces of legislation in place, whether it's the Taraba or Benue, they are not talking about abolishing open grazing. They are talking about regulation of open grazing. And quite clearly, open grazing has got to be regulated.
You talked about 2019 being around the corner and the fact that this also seems to be affecting it. And it would seem that also the air has been polluted, you know, trying to find solutions with religion coming into it, you know, and ethnicity as well also coming into it. How do you think we can begin to desegregate the strands and get really to what is at the heart of the problem?
Quite honestly, first of all, I think we've got to segment this. The language of grazing colonies should be taken off the table at this time.
So you would not support the federal government's cattle colonies proposal?
The operative expression is at this time, because the word colony is very loaded. Whether you're looking at the instinctive response to it, or indeed the linguistic connotations of the word, is very loaded. At a time when perceptions are polluted, you don't want to be throwing that incendiary on the table. No, I'll take it out. Now, the first thing is, how do you, the French would say, le crédibiliser le gouvernement. That is to say, to return credibility to government on this particular question. Now, to do that, in my view, will not cost money. It requires emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence on the part of a government that has appeared distant, unconcerned, unbothered about thousands, quite literally, of its people being killed. And emotional intelligence to show we care at the level of the presidency, but also at the level of legislators. You require senators who are not going to be organizing Pirates of the Caribbean themed parties at a time when their constituents are being killed, who are not going to be organizing birthday parties, 60th, 65th, 50th, when their constituents are being killed. And I call out Senator Akume here, who was doing a birthday party while the blood of his constituents in Benue State had caked, or was caking. That's wrong. I call out Senator Dinomelaya here, who was doing Pirates of the Caribbean party when the blood of people of the Middle Belt, whom he represents, was on the floor. I call out Speaker Dogara here, who was doing 50th birthday party while our people were being killed. That is not very responsible leadership.